For many people, this inner voice becomes especially strong in individuals who are naturally sensitive to the emotional atmosphere around them. People who today are often described as empaths. Sometimes it feels almost like having an imaginary friend, a quiet presence somewhere inside the mind. Not visible, not separate from you, but always there, commenting. It appears after a conversation, after making a decision, or when you're about to try something new. And it says things like, maybe you shouldn't do that. You could have handled that better. What will people think? For many people, this voice becomes so familiar that it feels like a natural part of the mind itself, almost like an internal companion watching everything you do. A companion that evaluates, that warns, that questions. Psychology today often calls this voice the inner critic, and for many people, it seems impossible to escape it. It follows them into decisions, into relationships, into quiet moments when they are simply thinking about their lives. But something curious happens to some people during certain phases of psychological growth. The voice doesn't disappear because it was silenced. It doesn't vanish because everything suddenly became perfect. Instead, it slowly begins to lose its authority. The constant judgment fades. The pressure to monitor every action weakens, and the mind becomes quieter, almost as if a presence that had always been there has finally stepped aside. Why does this happen? And why do some people experience this shift so suddenly during periods of deep psychological change? To understand that, we first need to look at how this voice formed in the first place. At first, this voice can seem like a natural part of being human. After all, everyone learns to reflect on their actions. Everyone learns to think about consequences. But the voice that constantly judges, monitors, and evaluates us did not simply appear out of nowhere. It was built, slowly, quietly, over years of adapting to the world around us. Actually, no one is born with an inner critic. It develops gradually, as we learn how to live among other people. From the very beginning of life, we are surrounded by signals that teach us how the social world works. Some lessons are direct. Parents correct behavior. Teachers enforce rules. Adults explain what is acceptable and what is not. But many of the most powerful lessons arrive in quieter ways, through expressions of disappointment, through subtle disapproval, through the uncomfortable feeling of realizing that something we did was not well received. Over time, the mind begins to anticipate these reactions. Instead of waiting for others to respond, it starts simulating their judgment internally. The voice appears softly at first, a reminder, a small warning. Be careful. Think before you speak. Maybe you shouldn't do that. In the beginning, this inner voice serves an important function. It helps us adapt. It helps us avoid mistakes that might lead to rejection or embarrassment. In many ways, it protects our place within the social world. But the mind does not always know when to stop reinforcing a system that once served a useful purpose. As the years pass, the voice can grow stronger, more vigilant, more persistent. Instead of simply guiding behavior, it begins to evaluate almost everything. Every decision, every interaction, every small deviation from what seems socially acceptable. And because this voice has been present for so long, most people never question where it came from. It simply feels like part of who they are. But what feels natural inside the mind is not always the true center of the self. Sometimes, it is the echo of something that was learned, something absorbed from the expectations of the world around us. And this is where the story becomes more interesting. Because more than a century ago, a psychologist began to notice that many of the voices inside the human mind were not truly our own. They were roles, masks, structures built for the purpose of surviving in society. He called one of these structures the persona, Carl Jung used the word persona to describe the social identity each of us develops in order to function in the world. The term comes from ancient theater. In classical drama, actors wore masks called personae. Each mask represented a character presented to the audience. Jung believed something similar happens in psychological life. In order to participate in society, every person gradually develops a version of themselves that fits the expectations of the world around them. We learn how to speak in certain environments, how to behave in certain situations, how to present ourselves in ways that feel acceptable to others. This process happens so naturally that most people never notice it. We simply grow into the roles that seem to work. The responsible one, the agreeable one, the strong one, the reliable one. Over time, this social identity becomes extremely useful. It allows us to cooperate with others, to build relationships, to move through the structures of society without constant conflict. But the persona is not only something we show to the outside world. Eventually, it becomes internalized. The expectations that once came from parents, teachers, and social groups begin to live inside the mind itself. And that is often when the inner critic begins to take on a new role. It becomes the guardian of the persona. Instead of simply reminding us of social rules, the voice begins to protect the identity we have learned to present to the world. It quietly monitors whether our behavior fits the role we have adopted. If someone's persona is built around being responsible, the critic reacts strongly to mistakes. If the persona is built around being agreeable, the critic warns against disagreement. If the persona is built around being strong, the critic may reject moments of vulnerability. In each case, the voice is not simply judging behavior. It is protecting the mask. And for many people, this internal monitoring becomes so constant that it feels like an inseparable part of their personality. The voice seems natural, almost necessary. But Jung noticed something important. When a person begins to observe their own mind more carefully, they sometimes discover that this voice does not always speak for their deeper self. It speaks for the identity they learn to perform. And once this realization begins to appear, a subtle tension often follows. The person starts to notice moments when the role feels too narrow. Moments when maintaining the persona requires effort. Moments when the inner critic seems more concerned with protecting an image than with expressing something authentic. At first, these moments may be small. A hesitation before saying what one truly thinks. A quiet sense of exhaustion after maintaining a certain role for too long. A subtle awareness that the voice of judgment inside the mind may not represent the whole truth. And when this awareness grows stronger, another layer of the psyche begins to reveal itself. A layer that does not speak in the language of social expectations. A layer shaped by emotional experiences that have accumulated over the course of life. These emotional structures often react automatically, sometimes long before conscious thought has time to intervene. And Carl Jung believed these structures play a crucial role in many of the voices that appear inside the mind. He called them psychological complexes. These psychological complexes do something important inside the mind. They carry emotional memory, not as clear stories we can easily recall, but as patterns of reaction. When something in the present moment resembles a past emotional experience, the complex becomes active. And when it does, the reaction can feel immediate. Sometimes it appears as a sudden feeling of tension, sometimes as an instinct to withdraw, and very often, it appears through a familiar voice inside the mind. The voice that evaluates, the voice that warns, the voice that quietly says, "You shouldn't have done that. What if people notice? That was a mistake." What makes this voice so convincing is not the thought itself. It is the emotional energy behind it. A complex carries the emotional charge of past experiences. Moments when a person felt criticized. Moments when they felt embarrassed. moments when they feared losing acceptance. When a similar situation appears again, the complex reacts as if the original danger might return, and the inner critic becomes the messenger of that reaction. From the outside, it may seem like simple self-reflection, but inside the psyche, it is often something more automatic. A pattern that formed long ago, now trying to prevent the same emotional pain from happening again. If someone once received strong criticism after making a mistake, a complex may develop around the fear of imperfection. Then even small errors can activate the critic. If someone experienced rejection after expressing themselves honestly, a complex may organize itself around the fear of social disapproval. Then the critic may warn against speaking too openly. Over time, these complexes begin working together with the persona. The persona tries to maintain a stable identity in the social world. The complexes react whenever something threatens the emotional security of that identity. And the inner critic becomes the voice that tries to regulate the entire system. It warns. It corrects. It tries to anticipate danger before it arrives. In this way, the critic can seem almost protective, even necessary. For highly sensitive individuals, especially those who tend to absorb emotional signals from their surroundings, these internal reactions can feel even stronger. This is one reason why many empaths experience a particularly intense inner critic. But Jung noticed something interesting about these patterns. They only remain powerful as long as they operate automatically, as long as they are not clearly seen. The moment a person begins to observe these reactions more consciously, something subtle begins to change. The voice that once sounded absolute begins to reveal its origin. The mind starts to recognize when a reaction belongs to the present moment, and when it belongs to an older emotional pattern. And once that distinction begins to appear, the authority of the inner critic starts to weaken. Not because the complexes disappear immediately, but because consciousness is no longer completely inside them. It has begun to step slightly outside, and this small shift in awareness marks the beginning of something much larger. A transformation in the relationship between the individual and their own psyche. A transformation that Jung described as the process of individuation. When the process of individuation begins, something subtle starts to shift in the relationship a person has with their own mind. Externally, life may continue almost exactly as before. The same responsibilities remain. The same conversations happen. The same situations unfold. But internally, the relationship with that familiar voice begins to change. Earlier in life, the inner critic often feels almost like an invisible companion, a presence that constantly comments, a voice that evaluates what you did, what you said, and what you should have done differently. And for a long time, most people simply listen to it. The voice speaks, and its judgment is accepted almost automatically. If the critic says something was wrong, it must have been wrong. If the critic says something was embarrassing, it must have been embarrassing. The voice feels authoritative, almost like an internal supervisor that knows better. But during individuation, something begins to shift. The relationship with this invisible companion slowly changes. For many empaths, this stage can feel especially significant. After years of being highly attuned to the expectations and emotional reactions of others, the mind gradually learns to stand a little further back from those signals. Instead of simply listening to its judgments, the person begins to notice the voice itself. They hear the familiar commentary. But now there is a small distance between the voice and the one who hears it. It becomes possible to recognize the tone of the critic, to notice when it appears, to see the pattern of situations that tend to trigger it. In other words, the person no longer experiences the voice only from the inside. They begin observing it, almost as if the imaginary companion that once guided every reaction has stepped slightly into view. And once something inside the psyche becomes visible, its authority begins to change. The critic may still speak, but its words no longer feel like unquestionable truth. Sometimes the voice sounds exaggerated. Sometimes it repeats old fears that no longer fit the present moment. And sometimes it becomes clear that the critic is reacting not to what is happening now, but to something that happened long ago. With this awareness, the individual is no longer completely inside the reaction. There is now a second position within the psyche, the one who hears the voice, and recognizes that it is only a voice. And this shift changes everything, because the inner critic depends on one thing above all: automatic belief. As long as its judgments are accepted immediately, the voice retains its authority. But when the mind begins to observe the voice instead of obeying it, that authority begins to weaken. The critic may still appear, but it is no longer the ruler of the inner world. It has become something else, just one presence among many within the psyche. And when that happens, the system that once sustained the critic begins to reorganize itself. This is often the stage where many people first notice something unusual. The voice that once monitored every decision begins to grow quieter. For many people, the most surprising part of this process is what begins to happen next. The inner critic does not disappear in a dramatic moment. There is no final confrontation with the voice, no decisive victory over it. Instead, something much quieter unfolds. The voice simply begins to lose its central place in the mind. Situations that once triggered strong internal judgment start to feel different. A small mistake may happen. A conversation may not go exactly as planned. And yet the familiar wave of criticism does not arrive with the same intensity. The mind registers the moment, but the reaction feels lighter, less urgent, almost as if the internal system that once rushed to correct every detail has relaxed. At first, this change can feel strange. Many people spend years believing that the critic is necessary, that without constant self-evaluation, mistakes will multiply, that without internal pressure, discipline will disappear. But individuation gradually reveals something unexpected. The inner critic was never the true source of wisdom. It was the voice of adaptation, a voice shaped by the need to navigate social expectations and avoid emotional pain. When a person becomes more conscious of the structures inside their own psyche, those structures begin to reorganize themselves. The persona no longer needs to be defended so aggressively. The complexes no longer react with the same automatic force, and the observing awareness within the mind becomes stronger. From this position, the individual begins relating to life differently. Decisions no longer pass through constant internal judgment. Mistakes are noticed, but they are not magnified. Moments of vulnerability are no longer immediately rejected. Instead of being ruled by an internal supervisor, the person begins responding from a deeper center, a place that feels quieter, more stable, less concerned with constant approval. Carl Jung believed that this deeper center reflects something important in the psyche. He called it the self, not the social identity we present to the world, and not the voice that constantly evaluates everything we do, but the deeper organizing center of who we are. In simpler terms, you might think of it like this. The self is the part of you that does not need to constantly perform, the part that does not panic every time something goes wrong, the part that can see a situation clearly without immediately turning it into a judgment about your worth. When awareness begins to move closer to this center, something in the inner system begins to settle. The persona becomes just one role among many. The complexes lose some of their emotional urgency, and the inner critic is no longer the authority it once seemed to be. It may still appear from time to time, but its voice is different now. Softer, less convincing. Sometimes it feels almost like that invisible companion we spoke about earlier in the video, still present somewhere in the background, but no longer directing every step. And as this shift continues, many people begin noticing something they had not experienced for a long time. a quiet inner space, a space where thoughts can arise without immediate correction, where actions do not require constant justification, where the mind no longer feels permanently watched by its own internal judge. This silence is not emptiness, and it is not the absence of reflection. It is simply the absence of unnecessary judgment. The mind is still capable of learning, still capable of recognizing mistakes, still capable of growth, but the relentless voice that once monitored everything has stepped aside, not because it was defeated, but because it is no longer needed in the same way. For some people, this change can feel almost unfamiliar at first. After living for years under the constant presence of the inner critic, the quiet that appears later can seem unusual. There may be moments when the mind almost expects the familiar voice to return. A mistake happens, and the person waits for the usual wave of self-judgment. But sometimes, it simply does not arrive. Instead, the situation is seen more directly. A mistake is recognized for what it is. A moment of awkwardness passes. A conversation ends imperfectly. And yet the mind does not immediately transform the moment into a verdict about the self. This shift often feels subtle from the outside, but internally, it represents a profound reorganization of the psyche. The individual is no longer living under the constant supervision of the persona. Old complexes may still exist, but they no longer dictate every reaction. And the inner critic, once so dominant, begins to occupy a much smaller place in the landscape of the mind. Many people describe this stage as a form of psychological relief, not because life becomes easier, but because the mind is no longer constantly turning every experience into self-evaluation. Instead of asking again and again, "What does this say about me?" the mind becomes more interested in a different question. What is actually happening here? And that simple shift changes the entire tone of inner life. Experience becomes clearer, reactions become less dramatic, and the individual begins moving through the world with a sense of quiet psychological space. At the beginning of this video, we spoke about something that can feel almost like an imaginary companion, a quiet presence in the mind, a voice that comments on what we do, what we say, and what we should have done differently. For many people, that voice remains strong for most of their lives. It becomes part of the background of their thinking, something that constantly watches, evaluates, and corrects. But during deeper stages of psychological development, the relationship with that voice can begin to change. The imaginary companion does not necessarily disappear. It simply steps out of the center. The mind no longer treats every judgment it produces as absolute truth. Instead, there is space. Space to observe. Space to choose. Space to respond more directly to life itself. Carl Jung believed that individuation gradually moves a person toward this kind of inner freedom. Not the freedom of having no inner structure, but the freedom of no longer being ruled by unconscious patterns. And interestingly, when the inner critic begins to lose its authority, something else often changes as well. The need for constant approval from others begins to fade. The two processes are deeply connected. If you've ever noticed that strange moment when external validation suddenly feels less important than it once did, you might find the next part of this journey familiar. There is a video on this channel that explores exactly that moment, when the search for approval quietly comes to an end. You may want to watch it next, and something quieter takes its place. A deeper center of awareness, a place from which life can be lived with more clarity, and far less unnecessary judgment.